real honor to be part of this series and to get the chance to talk about my work here with this audience. I always like the discussion portion a lot more than the presentation portion, but of course you need to get through the latter to get to the former. So I will jump right into it. I will just say, by way of background, that one of the motivations for this project is a little bit broader and more amorphous than I'm hoping will come across in this particular presentation. So what Linda just described is a very large set of topics that I'm interested in, and my research is actually almost that broad. I'm really interested in how the current so-called aging crisis in healthcare is confronted and exacerbated by ageist tendencies among healthcare providers as well as the public at large that are fueled by media depictions of aged persons, particularly aged persons with dementia. But here I want to focus on something more narrow, a little bit more conceptual, but I also hope something that actually has some practical value, because that's always the challenge for those of us coming from a philosophy background. Okay, so this is the basic plan for the presentation. I will try to be not too verbose and not take too long with each point. This is what I'm hoping this isn't hubristic. I think it's a pretty modest proposal that I'm making in this particular presentation, in that I'm using a sort of limited and I hope focused set of focused bit of evidence to say, look, we might have reason to shift from a focus on autonomy to a primacy of agency when evaluating and planning, guiding, etc., assistive tech development in health. Okay. So just a bit of background. Probably everybody here knows the stats very well, so I'm not going to read through them or anything. I just do this with all the work because it gives you an idea of well, not just the state of affairs, but how the state of affairs is presented. So there's definitely a focus on how much is being consumed by older persons, and a prediction of how much more will be consumed and how much of a risk or threat this will pose to the sustainability of the healthcare system. So I have been told that these numbers are not necessarily the evidence behind these numbers is not necessarily unquestionable. I thought that I'd retrieve them from fairly reliable sources like the Canadian Medical Association, but just to point out, there is potentially some contention about the exact numbers there. So if you want to get anything about health economic stats, we can try. I will do my best. But otherwise, I think that this gives you at least a basic picture. Okay. So because of this situation, assistive technology, as we all know, has been introduced as a way of getting around this large and exponentially increasing population of seniors who are consuming a much larger portion of the resources than other members of the population. Assistive technology is for many people a kind of well, it's a beacon of hope for not only those who suffer from the conditions that render them vulnerable and render them more needy of healthcare services, but also for the healthcare system itself and the way of life that it supports here in Canada and other industrialized nations. So there is some criticism already about that sort of focuses on the dearth of ethical analysis of assistive technologies and the way that they're directed and supported. I'm not going to focus on that so much here. What I want to talk about is if there were more robust and pervasive ethical analysis of these technologies, what would it look like and why would we think that's a problem? So I want to critique the currently available theoretical resources that are most commonly used that would be commonly used in order to evaluate those practices. I'm going to say that those ethical resources, when put into use for evaluating AT, because of the populations that we're looking at, that we're looking to serve with assistive technology, are going to be largely ill-suited to the task. So before I get into why that is and how that works, I want to take a little bit of a step back and see how autonomy works in bioethics, because I don't think it's as straightforward as it necessarily seems. So one interesting thing about autonomy in terms of its status as a moral principle is that, well, obviously it has very deep historical roots in serious philosophy. Kant is probably the first person who comes to mind for many of you, and also much political philosophy, obviously. It wasn't apparently getting much action for a long time between Kant and like the 70s. And what really brought it back into gear, back into focus, was the emergence of bioethics as a legitimate discipline. So as bioethics emerged in the 70s, it was doing so partly in reflection of the broader political and social movements that were happening that emphasized individual rights and entitlements, as opposed to the more virtue-oriented, character-oriented, Hippocratic oath focused ethical appeals that were more common before that. So bioethics took up the autonomy cause. In so doing, it also, according to some at least, fundamentally altered its nature and its moral significance. And so I divide here the concept and the moral principle just because they're not exactly the same thing. Autonomy can generate moral obligations or moral entitlements, but autonomy itself, while arguably inherently normative, it is not a moral obligation itself. So just to clarify that. So there was this nearly revolutionary shift from the Hippocratic oath, the virtuous physician, to prioritizing a kind of more legal language of rights and individual entitlements. And autonomy became the central analytic tool for bioethics. In that way, given how central it became and given the major role of bioethics in revitalizing the concept and making it relevant again, critiquing autonomy is sort of just like critiquing bioethics, mainstream bioethics. So in a lot of the discussions and critiques you see about what they call mainstream bioethics, it's often largely a critique of autonomy as a concept and as a moral principle. Okay, so the version that's used in bioethics, clinical and research ethics, is, according to some, so Louise Campbell is one of the people I'm drawing on here, is a very vastly simplified version of its originating philosophical concept. Understandably so, because its purpose is to be applied. Its purpose is to be instrumentalized in the practice of good medicine. So it's not something that is important as a concept to sort out what kinds of obligations exist and why. In a more abstract sense, it has to be easily concretized. And in this way it was simplified. Okay, so in applied bioethics, and specifically clinical context, the normative force of autonomy is primarily in its prohibition of unwanted interference and or coercion. So it's largely a mandate for restraint or constraints that prohibit particular kinds of intervention or actions on others. So it creates a kind of inviolable kind of force field around the individual so that, doctor can't just say he knows best, so he knows to give, medication A, even if the patient is, say, not too happy about receiving that medication. whatever that might be. So, in relation to assistive technology, what's interesting is that, from what I can tell, there's not just a focus on how autonomy can help justify the prohibition of unwanted interference. It's also about how assistive technology can enhance or, undesirably diminish the autonomy of vulnerable persons. So assistive technology takes autonomy to a different kind of level. So it's asking the concept to do a little bit more maybe than was originally intended or at least implied in earlier bioethical discourse. So whereas the roots of autonomy lie in that kind of direct counter to physicians overstepping their bounds and acting paternalistically when that's not justified, here in the assistive technology context, we're saying, okay, we can actually use this intervention to help vulnerable people become less dependent. So it has this positive, active role. And what is the vulnerable population that we're talking about? For me, it is older persons with dementia. So that is the target population I'm using. I completely understand why some might say, well, that seems a little bit arbitrary. Why would you draw the line there? I have my reasons. I'm happy to discuss them more in the question period. For now, I'm just going to say it has to do with this being not a real category, but a socially and culturally and medically meaningful category. So things happen to you, your life is affected by your perceived or actual membership in that created category. So that's why I think it's a legitimate way of carving out that population. Okay, so why might autonomy be, at first blush, problematic to apply to this population? Assistive technology is, much of it is directed to the service of people with dementia, primarily to help them become or to stay more independent. But as Pullman indicates, he's there for that reference, there's something a little bit weird about that because, obviously there's going to be some, the autonomy present, if it is present, is going to be compromised to some extent. So it's going to be limited, it's going to be in flux, and whether or not you're the kind of person who believes in the generally dynamic and shifting nature of autonomy, you're certainly going to think that there are issues with counting it as reliable and consistent in a population with dementia. So that's maybe a major problem here. So people are vulnerable because, partially, of their more limited autonomy. So how are we going to use that particular concept and moral principle to guide our thinking about what interventions would be best for them? Okay. Right, and so another way of putting the problem for me is, it might seem like if autonomy is the central principle, choices might seem to stop mattering once one is not autonomous. And given the emphasis on autonomy, there's an idea that personal freedom to act on one's interests is a matter of autonomy. And so if you don't have it, then that personal freedom basically becomes irrelevant to whatever your decision-making is for a given intervention. So there wouldn't be any built-in reasons to attend to interests in personal freedom once autonomy is largely absent, or at least it seems like that to me and some other people. Okay, so I think that there are a few ways that we can contrast autonomy and agency. And I hope this is interesting and illustrative. I might not have done this because obviously there are several others who categorize different types of autonomy. But because I wanted to offer suggestions for the other side of it, so how an agency view would work, I thought it would be good to break it down myself as well. So the first one I identify as structural. So a structural definition of autonomy usually has to do with whether the different levels of one's will are harmonious. So whether one agrees with the desires that one has so that one can fully adopt a particular motivation to act, as opposed to saying, well, you know, I really want to be healthy, but I also love eating cake for every meal. So if you're in that situation, then you're not going to be as autonomous as somebody who also just doesn't really like cake and they just like eating healthy foods. You might go for a less demanding version, which is just coherence. So you don't have to identify with the desire to be healthy. You just have to end up with a will that's harmonious, that has the various levels of desire and harmony. An agency perspective, I think, would just go with whatever the first order desires were, as opposed to worrying about whether there was adequate reflection on the appropriateness or the desirability of those first order desires that then could form a willing action. Okay, I'm going to go more quickly because I know I'm already running out of time. Okay, so I'm going to skip to substantive incapacity. So as opposed to the more procedural or formal account of autonomy that we find in the structural definition, the substantive definition is usually drawing on capacities for particular forms of rational thinking, self-reflection, self-determination, that sort of thing. But rationality and a cognitivist approach to capacity is kind of the hallmark of that substantive approach, versus socio-emotive. So that would be, for me, a kind of agency that would be more inclined to focus on whether the individual is able to express, be active as a subject. Okay, so I'm going to skip socio-political because I think it's fairly obvious. This is probably one of the more common ways of critiquing traditional versions of autonomy. So let's go to status. Status is the most directly ethically relevant distinction, I think, because it looks at what those attributes mean to what the individual is entitled. So if an individual has personhood, then she is the sort of thing that belongs in the moral community in the full sense, and therefore she has the full range of moral entitlements and creates the full range of moral obligations on others. Personhood, however, is a pretty demanding category to be in. Why? Because it usually draws on cognitive capacities like rationality, projecting oneself into the future, critical thinking, and the like. So it's a pretty demanding category, again, to fall into. Whereas selfhood or subjecthood, I would think of as less demanding and more diversely realizable. So subjecthood is just about being a subject of a life and being capable of directed action. So being capable of action that is intentional in a very broad sense. Okay, so the problem with status. So the status-based treatment of autonomy versus agency, again, is implicitly normative. And the problem here is that if we're using autonomy as the primary value for evaluating and guiding assistive technology development or other forms of intervention development, then we're worried most and first about persons. But if we don't get to that personhood status, then we're worried about the other persons first. Why? Because that always takes priority. So of course we're also going to have to pay some attention to and give some consideration to other sorts of things like interests and welfare and general well-being, cost and the like. But we're going to have a necessary prioritization of the people involved, the real people. So in that way, we're going to talk about, okay, what does the family need? What do the caregivers need? What do the healthcare professionals need? What do other citizens need? And I think that that prioritization is reflected in the way that we talk about the crisis in healthcare. So we're worried about how we're going to meet the needs of those who have less capacity, that are vulnerable, because it's going to infringe on the interests and entitlements of those who are full people. And if we don't, and if we're not just paying attention to those other people, then we're focusing on, and we are focusing on the person with dementia herself, then we're still going to be limited to considering her interests as a living thing. So she needs shelter, she needs food and water. We're not going to have much reason, built-in reason and motivation to look into what she wants to do, to look into what sort of life she's trying to have, whatever that might be. So whether it's like Margot painting the same painting over and over again, or somebody who wants to look after a doll as their own, pretends it's their own, that's not going to readily feature into the calculus, at least in any really compelling way. I think it's possible. So, taking up certain forms of assistive technology and rejecting certain forms of technology can be motivated in ways that might ignore the person with dementia, instead pay more attention to those around her who are still full persons, and or pay attention only to the interests that have very little to do with her subjecthood. Okay. Whoops, no, that's, yeah. Okay, so why do I think agency is different? So why do I think it's better to go with an emphasis on whether the person is a real subject as opposed to a person? Because I think that this attaches us to more broadly intentional action that can then be responded to in a greater diversity of ways. So it's going to mandate more engaged responses on the part of healthcare professionals and tech developers. And I think it will help us end up in a position with more technology that actually works and less that doesn't really do what it's supposed to do for the person with dementia, because we've been actually trying to serve those around her. So this paper was, my work was originally inspired by Katherine who wrote articles about why shifting from autonomy to agency is desirable. Her reasons are a little bit different because she's more concerned about how expressions of autonomy that are not easily traced back to that classic liberal notion of autonomy are not going to be easily recognizable as autonomous, and therefore true choices, true free choices. But I think that what she says here is still highly relevant, because what we should care about is not just how people are compromised, but what they express about their desires and their directions, their desired directions, is worth paying attention to whether or not it's attached to some more basic fundamental capacity. And that's very much in parallel with her point. Okay, so I'm going to so there's some evidence that suggests that there is quite a bit of agency left in, okay, can I have 2 minutes? Yes. Okay, there is quite a bit of agency left in people with dementia, even advanced stages. So they're able to express preferences and aversions, etc. They're able to express some sense of identity. Okay, very quickly, what can agency do versus technology? So one of the examples that I think might be interesting is the role of deception in dementia care. So does anyone here watch BoJack Horseman? know one person does. Like, oh, well, okay. So in one episode, we see his mom, and I forget her name. I want to say Estelle, but I don't know if that's it. Let's say Estelle is given this dolly, and she, that dolly turns into a very important source of therapy and comfort for her. And once it is taken away from her, it's pretty chaotic. That kind of therapy, while obviously deeply contentious, apparently, from what I understand, although other people might have more familiarity with it, is seen as very contentious because, to lie to somebody is one of the worst things you can do because it violates their personhood. It fails to acknowledge them as persons who, who are entitled to be treated as things that get all the information and process it as such. If we don't see it that way, if we're focused more on experiential interests and on agency of the subject, then we might end up with something a little bit different, not necessarily just lying all the time to get people to calm down. That's not what I'm implying, but rather saying, okay, what is the individual seeking and how might that technological innovation help her obtain that? As opposed to merely constraining ideas that are presented as a way of enhancing autonomy or maintaining it. Okay, and that is it. Okay, I will leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Katherine, thank you so much for your presentation. A lot of information, a lot of new learning for us. And I should mention that from the start we agree on something. How difficult it is to approach the concept of autonomy. I do not have your expertise in ethics for sure, but I have been working under the supervision of Virginie Copigo at the School of Psychology at the University of Ottawa, and we have been conducting one of our major projects around ethical issues related to technology adoption, development, and commercialization when it comes to person with cognitive impairment. And we had a lot to deal with a lot of ethical issues. And our way of doing was to study those ethical issues from the start and all along the process. And autonomy was the most difficult, the most present, and the most challenging of of all the ethical issues that we have to cover, such as access, etc. We observed a situation where caregivers and researchers negate the right to autonomy to a person with cognitive impairment just because he was diagnosed or she was diagnosed with cognitive impairment. And in some research that we have studied, it was written as is. This is not the same person. So for them, it just no longer have the same preferences or the same wishes. This was also seen in other situations where persons with cognitive impairment were pressured to use technology or not to use technology because simply the staff behind or taking care of them, they have a positive or a negative attitude towards those technologies. So, autonomy, yes, it's a difficult concept. And in the studies that we have reviewed, we found out that it was always studied in conjunction with the concept of paternalism as an external threat. But we agree. Autonomy is internally more complicated, and we found more challenges in dealing with its internal difficulty than dealing with the paternalism, even if though it's very well studied. And as Bouchon and Childress pointed out, autonomy is rich in paraphrase, loose in definition. And in our work, this was translated in a whole family of values such as respect of privacy, coercion, free and informed consent, self-regulation and management, etc. We did not, however, feel the need to look for another concept or another guiding principle to deal with autonomy. But we felt more in need of operationalizing, of looking of ways to make it more applicable to our reality, to our research. And this is how we did it. As an inclusive researcher, we engaged a person with cognitive impairment into the research, into the technology development. And by the way, I forgot to tell you that in our research, we do not only look to the ethical issues, but we are developing a technology, a self-management of medication, self-management application, an application of medication self-management. That's better. So, and person with cognitive impairment were from the start with us. And when we look into that, we did not see cognitive impairment. We are in the social model of handicap, and we did not see cognitive impairment as the obstacle. The impact of cognitive impairment on daily living and on research, and interaction of other environmental elements, that's what creates the handicap situation. That's where there is a problem that is linked to autonomy. And so, for example, the complexity of the technology linked to the fact that person with cognitive impairment in majority may have difficulty to deal or to treat a lot of information at the same time. That's what created the fact that they cannot use the technology, and that's may lead to undermine their capacity to use it. Also, for us, autonomy wasn't a binary variable. So you are autonomous or you are not. It was a continuum. And following our inclusive way of seeing it, we just felt as a researcher, as a group where we have technology developers, to adapt our way of doing to the person with cognitive impairment and its needs. So, like we did focus groups with them, and we brought the technology, and each time we make leverage of the level of the difficulty, of the application, of the research question, of all the documents we have, of the way how we did the focus groups according to their needs and their level of autonomy. Okay. Also, we kept autonomy as a guiding principle, but at the same time we were thinking, and it was one of our first questions, who has the right to say what's wrong and not? Who is like more suited to say what's wrong and what's right when it comes to autonomy? It was a long question, and our answer to that was to develop and to gather a transdisciplinary team. We have ethicists, we have lawyers, we have technology developers, we have psychologists, we have gerontologists. We bring them all together, and each time we have an ethical issue, it is dealt with, and we find solution all along with the technology development process. So, other thing, when we look into the technology development, we gave voice to person with cognitive impairment. For us, having cognitive impairment does not remove from the person its ability to participate and give his or her voice in that area. Finally, this umbrella concept of autonomy was operationalized through different types of concepts. So we looked into privacy, we looked at how to get free and informed consent. We developed the guidelines, recommendation, etc. around that. But also we looked into dignity. Dignity is, if autonomy is more related to decision making and other activities, dignity was more around the respect of person's ability, his preferences. So, and like even if a person gets less and less autonomous, dignity is still there. So we brought those two concepts together to guide us. Yes, with all this action and decision, we did not feel the need for another ethical principle to guide us. So my question to you today, do we really need another concept or guiding ethical principle to replace autonomy? Is agency, as proposed by Katherine, a better approach? What do you think?
Thank you. So, so Hajer and I have had some great conversations about this, and just a point about, just two things. So one is that I'm not saying I want to get rid of autonomy, and not that you were saying that I was out. I get, and I didn't necessarily make that clear. I just think that so my critique is more so targeting the, what I see as the primacy of autonomy and its, again, consistent prioritization and emphasis. I mean, in decision-making and the evaluation of potential interventions. Second thing is that, so it would be interesting to talk about, going back and forth on that, like, would you be open to, a supplemental concept as opposed to a replacing concept of autonomy? And yeah, so I mean, it would be great to hear more about what it means to give voice to the person with cognitive impairment. I think that in some ways we're not talking across purposes at all. We're actually kind of doing this, aiming for the same thing. I'm just maybe more wary of the concept of autonomy and how maybe it's very weighed down, politically loaded and complex, et cetera. Maybe I have more concerns that way. And then finally about dignity. I mean, so I think it's a really interesting idea. To me, dignity can be a very hazardous concept. I understand why it is used sometimes, and I don't, object to its use, full stop. But if we're going to include it in a secular environment where we're evaluating, again, interventions and policies, I think that it could be dangerous in terms of reinforcing ageism and ableism, because the undignified life is associated with the kind of life that many of these designated vulnerable populations have. So, the life that needs help toileting, the life that is dependent, the life that can't just move about as it chooses in a self-reliant way. So that would be my worry about bringing dignity in any, systematic way.
Awesome. Okay, great, thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience or comments? Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm Virginie Kovigo, I'm working with Hajer. Thank you two, for two great minds exchanging on very, very complex concepts and topics. I feel puzzled by the presentation, and I know you, Katherine, so I know that you do care for persons with cognitive impairments.
Yes.
I know that. I'm more worried of how your message might be received, and especially when you talk about deception being okay.
Yeah.
We have such a hard time making sure that people understand that it's not because you have cognitive impairments that all the decisions about your life belong to someone else. That I'm worried that deception will be the excuse that many of us who have our brain functioning properly, or we think it's functioning properly, I'm worried that the deception is the excuse we are looking for to justify the fact that we are making decisions for them, without them, just to make sure that our needs are met and not the needs of those with cognitive impairments. Have you thought about how to frame your suggestion?
Yes, thank you very much for that. Yeah, I'm glad that it's a great question, and you gave me the opportunity to make myself look like less of a monster, hopefully, because that is the idea. That is part of the project that that is least developed, I'll say, and because I'm very poor with time management, I had to rush through it, which made it even more messy. So I'll just say first, I completely understand why that would, why my endorsement of deceptive practices in at least some instances with people with dementia could be seen as, disrespectful and condoning, if not encouraging, that kind of instrumentalizing approach to vulnerable persons that we're trying to avoid. I completely get that, and it might have that repercussion no matter what, no matter how that allowance for deceptive practice might be presented and mitigated, or limited. But here's my thought. So why do we think the deception is bad? I think we think it's bad because it is bad to withhold information or to falsely portray information that is required for somebody to be in the world that they perceive and to move about in the world that they perceive. That's sort of my thinking. That, when somebody lies to me or withholds important information to me, they are wronging me because they are not letting me act as I would like to in my world. So for people with dementia, in some cases, I think that facilitating their acting in their world might be more likely to entail some kind of deception than to not. So I'm thinking specifically of, relaying old bad news or new bad news. So a spouse dying, post diagnosis. So, where's Henry? I'd like to see Henry. Well, he just died in a car accident. And saying that over, and you will say it over and over and over again if you want them to know the truth. I know that's a specific instance, but I think that's not that uncommon, and that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking of. So it's, to my mind, not just a protective mechanism, which you could say, well, it's just for their own good. It's just going to be harmful if you tell them the truth. I think it's more than that. I think that if you are deceiving them with the intention to pay respect to them as the kind of person who cared a great deal for their spouse and valued their relationship and valued the activities that they did in their relationship, that you're going to be motivated in the right way and you're going to deceive in the right way.
But the thing is that in that case, some of you might say the truth, some of you might hide the facts. Like deception to be properly done has to be coherent. There is no way a team plus the informal caregivers and the families and the neighbors will have a coherent message.
But would it have to be coherent? I mean, I don't. So why?
And I think the other disagreement that we have is because I don't think about persons with dementia specifically. I think about persons with cognitive impairments. And cognitive impairments are not necessarily going to worsen over time. It's not necessarily degenerative. And cognition is, brain functions are diverse. And it's not because one aspect of your cognitive functioning is altered, that all your cognitive functioning is altered. And so how can you operationalize your suggestions in a life where persons are so diverse, have so diverse needs? And I think we'll need to talk more, Katherine.
I'd like, along these lines, I have a question or a concern. Like, autonomy is in the ear and eye of the person that's outside the person we're seeing is autonomous or not, right? I mean, that's what you were saying in a way, like, I will judge you as being autonomous or not. And so I will rely on things, and if I have a diagnosis for you, everything will fill it. I will perceive that, and I will fill all of these things in, because we know there are people that are supposed to be competent and have, high-powered jobs, and so on. Some people will remain unnamed, but they have these high-powered jobs, and they're actually not very competent when you read them, and you could probably say they should not be autonomous, but because they've got these jobs and so on, you're kind of saying, all right, they're autonomous, they're great, they can do these things and make decisions and all of these things, but put a diagnosis of dementia on that exact same person, and all of a sudden you're perceiving them as autonomous. My question around autonomy for the two of you, and I just want to clarify. So if I judge you as being autonomous or not, I may make decisions about whether or not technology will help or not for you. And I will look at the technology, as you very clearly said, Katherine, in relation to my needs, right? Because I judge you as being autonomous. What I was hearing from you, Hajer, was looking at also the use of technology to demonstrate autonomy. So in other words, to use, like I can either take, before I'm actually looking at the use of technology for you, and make a judgment about your autonomy, and decide what and how and if you get some technology. But I can also say, I want to look at use of technology so that you are perceived to be more autonomous. And I was wondering if that made sense to you, and if there's if that helps in terms of looking at our agency versus autonomy, because it really resides in the person that's looking at you.
Maybe I'll start by an example,
Yeah.
a real
Yeah.
example, and can build on that. Let's say, we saw a lot of examples in the research that we studied, persons having were diagnosed with dementia, or they have already cognitive impairment and aging with it. And then one family member or a caregiver found out this new amazing technology outside. And yeah, it's like with all the good intention in the world, he thinks that his dad or his mom will be able to use it, and it will help them stay autonomous and maybe so they think beneficence. And they buy that technology. Let's say a tablet that they bring it to someone who has dementia, and he has spent, their dad or their mom has or she spent over 25 years working, for example, for the government and using a laptop and a keyboard. Then they are faced with a tablet, tactile. For the person who bought it, it's amazing, it's tactile, it's much easier to use. But for that person having dementia, you know what's that mean? It's a new learning, it's a new challenge. It's maybe a situation where he or she live situation of failure. And so this is one example. From the other side, there are also people with cognitive impairment, dementia, and this is, I'm going to cite to technology that is very well used, the bracelet with the GPS. Many of them at a certain point, there is a risk for their safety when they go by their own. But with this technology, their surrounding will be feeling more, let's say, more comfortable, letting them get out and having that autonomy, that independent, let's talk about the independent life, leave autonomy aside, with that technology. So in this way, this technology is helping maintaining the independence of the person. So you see, just I'm illustrating, and I let you know, comment on that.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's so you're kind of picking up on the kind of feedback system between the interventions that are designed to increase autonomy, and then perceived autonomy, and then actual, and then because that's, I mean, so that it sounds like you're suggesting, Linda, that autonomy is not just internal. It can also be almost like a performance. So you can gain autonomy through your, almost like an ability to pass sort of thing. And then it could also be perceived as, or conceptualized as real or perceived freedom from constraint. So somebody might be incompetent, but if they can do whatever they want, then you might bestow the status or the attribute of autonomy onto them, or say that they have some, they can make some autonomous decisions. So I mean that's a really interesting idea, and I remember reading one example, a discussion of how some tech can be stigmatizing because people think, oh, now everybody who sees me knows that I need this help, etc. But some devices can do just the opposite and build up their self-esteem and confidence, especially if it's something that is commonly used. So computers used by the youngins or whatever. That was one of the examples that they threw out there. So, so tech that helps with self-perception, I think, would make a lot of sense, because we know that that imposing needs through like acting as if the person needs more help reduces confidence and then reduces ability. So the opposite seems like,
Maybe I said something. Autonomy, like in many of the research, it is just focused on autonomy of decision. It's more than that. There is the autonomy of the execution of the action related to that decision. And like, let's say, sometimes we found people who did not decide to select the technology or to buy it. But that technology, they use it to be autonomy in the execution of tasks. So I think we have to broaden a little bit. And autonomy can be delegated, can be assisted, but can be also direct.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, I want to thank you very, I really like this notion of looking at, I think with technology, I think some of the takeaway messages, many of the takeaway messages is questioning, how we use this term, autonomy, what we actually mean. I think we've kind of, unwrapped it a little bit about what it means, because it's one of those things that's given out there for sure and used regularly. It's also a very much of a Western thinking kind of concept, I think, in terms of, of what we need. I know that when we're talking, colleagues of mine who work in developing countries who say, Maslow's scale of needs and so on is very Western thinking, right? And you can have like none of the basic stuff, but you have this self-actualization because you know what your role is in life, and you can do those things despite having dementia, right? You can still be giving love and being attached to people and doing all of these things, even in the very, very advanced stages of dementia. And so I think it's a very good thing for all of us to question what we mean by these terms. I also think there were some interesting thoughts around how once we have in our heads, and I think this happens a lot, once we have in our heads that people are quote unquote incompetent and therefore that equals non-independent, we do go into these modes of we'll make decisions for you. Even though, and I agree with you, Hajer, it's not a black or white thing. There is a continuum about the kinds of things you can and can't do. But we tend as a society to do you are or you aren't. And the minute you go over to the you aren't, then people do make decisions for you all the time for all kinds of things. And not only that, when we ask in terms of policy of how to move forward on things, we're asking those people most of the time. More and more we're starting to include people with dementia. But we still see a lot of asking people about what they think people with dementia needs, whether it's the caregivers, whether it's, whether it is the healthcare professionals or whomever, it's always the perspective. And so automatically, if you have in your mind that this person cannot function, you will be fall into that trap. So
I was just going to say, and evidence suggests that there is a disparity between perceived needs on the part of healthcare providers and caregivers and people with dementia. So if that's true, then there's obviously some kind of disconnect that has to do with not seeing what is of primary concern to them. And I think the primary concern is psychological distress associated with their condition, and also having the right kind of information. To me, the question is, so then the right kind of information to do what? I think to,
yes,
do what you'd like to do, whatever that might be. So.
And whose problem is it anyway, right? Because we talk a lot about responsive behaviors, and the idea is people in the literature will talk about disruptive behaviors of people with dementia, and it's disruptive to whom, right? So if I decide to excuse my example, but these are things that happen. If I have advanced dementia and I start urinating in the corner, that's going to be disruptive to you guys, but it may not be disruptive to me.
Yeah.
Right? And so or if I lash out at you, I'm responding now more and more. We're realizing in the literature that I'm responding to something in the literature, in the environment, whether it's physical or social or something like that. And so we're starting to think about, wait a minute, it's not inherent to my dementia. I don't have this label on me that dictates everything that I'm doing. It's actually, I am reacting to what is happening in my environment.
Yeah, exactly. And then that approach that labels it as disruptive and a thing to be
Corrected.
Yeah, corrected, is a
Yeah.
very managerial kind of approach
Exactly.
that is ultimately probably not going to alleviate the root concern that's causing whatever disruptive behavior.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so,
yeah, and so that your whole notions around agency and stuff and what, what I can or can't do about this.
We are currently analyzing data and data collected from caregivers and data collected from persons with cognitive impairment related to information technology use. And we found out, we look to behaviors and attitude towards privacy. And it's promising what we are finding that persons with cognitive impairment are really interested. They want to use those technology. And for them, it's a way to socialize, to interact with others. But with the caregiver, it's a whole set of attitudes and behavior completely different. They are more derived by protection, paternalism. They are more derived by they cannot use it. They are derived by we need to protect them. They are derived by the fact, so they are negating to them a technology that can help. And it's just, I'm amazed. And it's not new finding, because we are just comforting findings and results that exist around. We found even what's most interesting, that the amount and the quality of the support they give to this person they care for when they are using this technology depend, like, really to their attitudes, their proper attitudes and behavior around the technology itself and the person, of how do they see cognitive impairment and what's related to it.
Hence the importance of looking at these concepts within the context of technology to see whether or not what we can use, how, when, in what situation, with whom. These are all important questions in terms of these concepts. Are there any last, any burning comments? Yes, Ajahn.
Just a comment. When we talk about autonomy and independence, it seems that it has a lot to do with the assessment. How is it being assessed? Whether the tool used and the methodology, whether it is comprehensive and holistic from different considerations. Is that correct? Well, what I mean, because earlier you mentioned about the perception from the person who is doing the assessment, or the perception. So it has a lot to do with what tools or methods they use it to assess the autonomy and the independence of the person.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? I'm just reflecting.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, in my opinion, there is the diagnosis,
Okay.
but there is, so diagnosis will determine a level of severity or a diagnosis.
Okay.
And there is a perception from the caregiver and the person with cognitive impairment around its level of autonomy.
Yeah. So we have to consider both
so-
the objective and subjective
Yes, exactly.
part and
For
put
example,
it together.
many of the research, we did a systematic review around the use of some technology, and we found out, very important, people at the early stage of dementia, they, even if they had those bracelets with GPS, they refused to wear them, or they abandoned them because they perceived themselves autonomous, while people who bought or like pressured them to wear them did not. So yeah, so like personally, I distinguish between what the diagnosis and it evaluates, of course, and the perception of people around autonomy.
Right, and I think what's real, perceptions are real to people. So, if those family members they'll perceive it to themselves as that person not being autonomous and so needs this bracelet. And it is a real perception to them, and so you need to take all of these information. But I think, as you were saying, you do need to take all this information, but I think you need to be careful. The other thing too is dementia will add a mask that prevents you from seeing what's underneath. And so if you come with the assumption that you can't function, you will pick out everything that you see that confirms your perception that this person cannot be autonomous, and the inverse being true as well. I'm going to go to the woman behind me, and now I'm coming back to you.
Thank you both. This is a really interesting conversation. So I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. I work in qualitative health research, evaluating medical devices. And so I think one of the things I see in the work that I do, sort of synthesizing qualitative research and patient and caregiver perspectives, is the ways in which patients and caregivers can articulate societal values. And so when we think about autonomy, it maps onto this conversation about we think people are incapacitated, and we have ideas around, we privilege able-bodiedness, we have very strong ideas around what that is, and as a society. And so I'm just wondering if someone can speak to, and how do we use concepts, whether, I'm sorry I came in late, so about how autonomy and agency and concepts map onto the world when we have such preconceived notions and heavily value-laden ideas around what autonomy is and what, and so I'm just teasing out a lot of the conversation has happened on the level of what do we do in individual interactions with healthcare providers versus how do we organize a healthcare system per se, and that those two things might, so I'm thinking of interventions to make us all recognize our able-bodied state is temporal. Right. Anyway, I'll just stop rambling, but yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and honestly, that's one of the, I mean, I may very well be wrong, but that's one of the reasons that I think shifting to prioritizing agency is going to be more beneficial / more conducive to creating just conditions for people designated as vulnerable, because you don't have to. So we're talking about perceptions of competence and capacity and rationality, legitimacy. Those things are, I think, inevitably going to come into play when you're wondering whether somebody is autonomous, so that you can, take their choice or desire or preference seriously. I think that with agency and a focus on their just existence, their subjective existence, you don't really have to do that. It doesn't really matter what the desire is coming out of, or why they have that particular preference, or whether it is emerging from a rational basis. What matters is that they have it and are expressing it and are moving towards it. Now, you're going to have to do some critical consideration afterwards, so it's not like they're going to be, it's not like that's the end of the story in terms of evaluating the appropriateness of a given intervention, or that can facilitate action or limit action or whatever. But I think that it's exactly that value-ladenness of autonomy that's one of the main reasons I think there's for moving away from its prioritization when it comes to dealing with, again, so-called vulnerable populations, especially those with cognitive impairment. So I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, it was really very difficult and very hard to have what's autonomy? Okay, we are developing technology, but for whom? So, to start, as I said tout à l'heure, our answer was really not to give that burden of the answer to this question to one person. It was a team, and we discussed around what autonomy. How can we adapt to it? So we had, for example, the technology developers we are working with. They looked at us at a certain point, and they wanted us to have a user profile, a person with cognitive impairment. We cannot. It just is so variable, and it was a real challenge, because for them, they will develop for the technology that will help with the autonomy of that user, model user, but it does not exist. So what we finally, we found a solution. As I told you, it's a team. It has to be a teamwork. It has to be discussed. So we discussed, and we finally finished it by developing a matrix with all the possible characteristic, and it can vary this, but a person can be here in modifying skills, but it can be in memory in this, and like it was very interesting, but just to tell you that it's a shared, discussed, constructed perception of autonomy that we have